Serious about that peep. Or peep. Is it eep?
Eep, it's Eep, right?
Pick a fire. You don't need two people anymore. I can't tell much time I wasted cleaning rocks. This is amazing. It's such a time saver, and it's so simple.
See that wall? Yeah. You want to jump in? Yeah. I'm not allowed to go outside the wall. Don't worry. We'll be back before anyone knows.
Grug, wanna go for that ride?
Pretty impressive, eh, Grug? Funny story. Every
At all? Honestly, it sucks out there. If no one's died before breakfast, it's a win. It is so much better in here. Oh.
I have a scar. You have a scar. I have a scar. Ow!
my hand. You're planning on leaving it back. And I don't like you at all.
Now that's interesting.
You know, maybe I just need to get to know you better.
No, not that. The part about...
Now listen, nonsense. Seriously, we gotta talk about these things. No, I like not.
Welcome back to the Cine Flux. If you are here for the first time, I am genuinely glad you found your way to this corner of the internet, a place where we do not just talk about films, we sit with them, we turn them over slowly, we ask what they are really made of. And today, I want to talk about something that surprised me more than I expected it to. Something I walked into with low expectations and walked out of feeling not transformed, not shaken, but warmed. Genuinely, unexpectedly warmed. I want to talk about a film that understands something quiet and true about the families we build, the ones we are born into, and the impossible, beautiful friction between holding on and letting go. So settle in, pour something warm. This one is going to take us somewhere worth going. There is a specific kind of light that animated cinema can create, a light that no live action film can quite replicate, where the world glows from within, where every color carries an emotional weight that the real world simply does not have access to. Think about the opening of a great animated film. Think about how that first image does not just show you a world, it invites you into a feeling. Now hold that thought, because what I want to ask you before we go anywhere near the story, the characters, the themes, is this: what happens when a sequel arrives that is braver than its original? What happens when a film that could have coasted instead decides to rage? That is not always what animated sequels do. In fact, it is rarely what they do. But every so often, one of them surprises you. Every so often, one of them earns its existence. And that is precisely the space where the Croods A New Age lives. The Croods A New Age is a 2020 animated feature from DreamWorks Animation, directed by Joel Crawford in his feature directorial debut, produced by Mark Swift and distributed by Universal Pictures. It is the sequel to the Ordinary 2010 film The Croods, and it returns to a prehistoric world that is not historically accurate in any meaningful sense and is not trying to be. This is not a film about the Pleistocene, this is a film about people. The voice cast is largely the same as the original. Nicolas Cage returns as Grug, the fiercely protective father of the Croods family, Emma Stone as Eve, his independent and yearning daughter, Ryan Reynolds as Goo, Eve's boyfriend who spent the first film introducing the family to the terrifying concept of tomorrow, Catherine Keener as Uga, the quietly wise mother, Clap Dook as Thunk, and Cloris Leachman as Gran. Joining them this time are Leslie Mann and Peter Dinklage as Hope and Phil Betterman, a couple who, and this is where the story truly ignites, turn out to have known gay before the Croods ever did. The film runs approximately 95 minutes, carries a PG rating, and sits in that particular DreamWorks tradition of animated comedies that are, at their core, about something achingly human beneath all the noise and color. Joel Crawford, at the time a first time feature director, though a DreamWorks veteran, brings an energy to this film that is looser and wider than the original, and yet somehow more emotionally honest in its best moments. The screenplay is credited to Kevin Hageman and Dan Hageman, along with Paul Fisher and Bob Logan, a room full of writers that could have produced a bloated mess and instead produced something that, despite its flaws, has a genuinely beating heart at its center. The film is animated at DreamWorks Animation, with a visual ambition that takes the extraordinary color palette of the first film and expands it into something even more lush, even more hyperreal, a world of impossible pinks and ancient greens where every environment feels designed not as backdrop but as emotional landscape. This is a film that understands, at the level of art direction, that where characters exist shapes who they become. I want to tell you what it was like to sit with this film for the first time, because I think my experience of it is useful to understand before we go further. When I first came to the Croods A New Age, I expected very little. I want to be honest about that. Animated sequels, particularly to films that were warmly received but never quite considered among the great animated works, have a particular gravitational pull toward mediocrity. They tend to recycle what worked, soften what was too sharp, inflate what was too modest, and emerge blinking into the world as something that exists primarily to reactivate a franchise. I have seen enough of them to walk in with my defenses up, and so when the film began, I was watching with the particular careful attention of someone who is waiting to be disappointed. Not unkindly, but honestly, I was cataloguing, I was measuring, I was at a professional distance. And then something happened that I did not predict. Somewhere in the early exchanges between Glug and Guy, somewhere in the quiet tension of a father who has spent one entire film learning to trust a young man and still has not entirely let go, I felt something shift in my chest. Not because the film had suddenly become Pixar level profound, not because it had said something new, but because it had found a truth that most sequels are too comfortable to look for. It had looked at its own characters and asked, genuinely asked, what do these people actually fear? Not the world outside the cave, not the predators in the dark. The real fear, the one that keeps parents awake and children restless, the fear of being left, the fear of being replaced, the fear that the people you love will build a life that has no room for you in it. That is what this film is quietly, steadily, sometimes clumsily about, and when I realized that, my posture changed. I sat forward, I stopped cataloging and started watching the opening sequence of The Croods. A New Age moves quickly, almost too quickly at first, as it re-establishes the world, the family, and the status quo they have reached since the first film. Ruga and Oga and the whole extraordinary, exhausting, beloved Croods clan are still wandering, still searching for the mythical place called Tomorrow that Dee described in the first film. And Guy and Deep are still navigating that delicate electric thing that happens when two young people who found each other at the end of the world try to figure out what comes next. The film opens with the kind of physical comedy that DreamWorks animated films do well, big, bold, cartoonishly dangerous. And it is genuinely funny. It moves fast. It is warm. It nursed these characters, but what strikes me most about the opening 15 minutes is not the comedy or even the action. It is the quiet scene that sits beneath all the noise. It is Grug watching Guy. Not with hostility, the hostility of the first film is gone. With something harder to name, a mixture of love and fear, and a slow dawning recognition that this young man beside his daughter is not a threat to be defeated, he is a future to be accepted. And that acceptance, in complete tender terrified, is the emotional engine that will drive everything that follows. Here is where the film shifts into something genuinely surprising. The Croods discover a walled garden, a literal paradise, lush and abundant and seemingly untouched, and within it they find the Bettermans. Phil and Hope Betterman, a couple who live in a treehouse that is, compared to the Croods' existence, almost incomprehensibly civilized. They have beds, they have begged, they have a daughter Dawn who immediately and wonderfully becomes Eve's first ever friend outside her family, and they have a history with Guy, a history that Gru and Aga and Eve do not know about, a history that Guy has been carrying like a stone in his pocket through the entirety of both films. The Bettermans knew Guy's parents. They made a promise to Guy's parents, and the particular shape of that promise, and what it would mean for Eve, for Gru, for the future of this strange, loud, beautiful family is where the film finds its deepest ground. What I want to do now is walk you through the experience of this film, not as a plot summary, not as a list of events, but as a journey. Because the story of the Croods, A New Age, is not complicated on the surface, but beneath the surface it is asking a question that almost every family has sat with at some point. It is asking, what do we owe each other? What do we owe the people who raised us? What do we owe the people we choose? And when those debts come into conflict, when the family you are born into and the family you are building pull in opposite directions, which direction do you go? The Bettermans, and this is what makes them such an interesting addition to this world, are not villains. This is a crucial choice, and I want to hold it up to the light for a moment because it would have been so easy, so cinematically lazy, to make them antagonists, to make Phil a schemer and Hope a snob, and let the Croods defeat them through the simple moral arithmetic of authenticity over privilege. But the film does not do that. Phil and Hope Betterman are something more uncomfortable and more interesting than villains. They are people who are trying to do the right thing for reasons that are genuinely good and genuinely selfish in almost equal measure. They want Guy to stay. They want to give him the life they believe his parents would have wanted for him, and they want Dawn to have a companion, a friend, maybe eventually something more. Their motives are tangled, love and obligation, and a little condescension, and a genuine sorrow for a boy they watched grow up from a distance. Peter Dinklage and Leslie Mann voiced them with a specificity and a warmth that the screenplay earns by not reducing them to caricature. And this is where I keep returning when I think about what the Croods A New Age is actually doing. It has built a story with two families in conflict, one ancient and loud and fiercely tactile, one modern and quiet and aspiring, and it refuses to declare a winner. It refuses to say that the Croods' way is better or that the better man's way is better. It says instead that every family is a system built to protect itself. Every family has a logic. Every family has a wound, and the wound at the center of this film is not the obvious one. It is not the rivalry between Grug and Phil, though that rivalry is very funny and occasionally transcendent in its physical comedy. The real wound is this: Guy has been alone for most of his life. He has been carrying the absence of his parents, the particular, specific absence of people who were taken too soon, and he has been building an identity around that absence. The Croods gave him a family, but the Bettermans are offering him something that the Croods cannot, a connection to who he was before, a thread back to the people he lost. Think about what that means for a moment. Think about what it means to a young man who has defined himself by forward motion, by always looking at the horizon, by championing tomorrow as a concept, by being the boy who moved toward the future when everyone else was hiding from it, to suddenly be offered a door back into the past, into the warmth and the grief of it, into the memory of parents he has taught himself not to mourn too visibly. The film handles this with more emotional intelligence than it is typically given credit for. And that emotional intelligence is what carries it across the moments where the comedy gets too broad and the plotting gets a little mechanical. The story moves through several distinct phases: the arrival at the Betterman estate, the slow fracturing of loyalties, the wild chaos of the film's second half, which escalates in ways that are sometimes too much and sometimes exactly right, before arriving at an ending that is quiet and surprisingly generous. The Croods do not defeat the Bettermans. The Bettermans do not defeat the Croods. What happens instead is something more honest. Two look at each other across a gulf of temperament and history and find, to their own mild shock, that they need each other. Not despite their differences, because of them. And here's where the film shifts completely. Because in the final act, what the story asks is not who wins. It asks whether we can let go of the version of love that needs to control and discover a version of love that knows how to open its hands. Group that enormous, exhausting, heroic, infuriating mountain of prehistoric paternal love has to learn something that no one told him and no one can teach you except life itself. That loving your child forward into their own life is not a loss, it only feels like one. I want to dig you now into the craft of this film, into what it achieves and what it falls short of, because the answer to both is more interesting than you might expect. Let us talk about what this film actually achieves at the level of craft, because I think this is where the Croods' A New Age tends to be either dismissed too quickly or praised too vaguely, and neither response serves it honestly. What I want to do is slow down. I want to look at the individual elements, the performances, the writing, the visual language, the score, the architecture of how it is all assembled, and ask, genuinely ask, what each of them is doing and whether it is doing it well. Because a film is not just a feeling. A film is a thousand decisions made in sequence, and the quality of those decisions is what separates something that moves you from something that merely entertains you. The Croods and New Age moves between those two categories more often than most people acknowledge, and understanding when and why it crosses that line is, I think, the most honest thing I can offer you. Start with the performances. In animated film, voice performance is everything and nothing simultaneously. It is everything because the entire emotional life of a character exists in a voice, in the catch of a breath, the rhythm of a sentence, the particular texture of how a person speaks when they are trying not to say the thing they most need to say. And it is nothing in the sense that the audience rarely thinks about it consciously. When animated performance works, you forget it is a performance at all. You simply believe in the character. And the remarkable thing about the voice cast of the Croods and New Age is how thoroughly, how completely, how unself-consciously they inhabit their roles. Nicolas Cage as Grug is, I think, one of the quietly underrated animated performances of the last decade. I do not say that lightly, and I want to earn that claim rather than simply assert it. Here is the thing about Nicolas Cage as an actor. He has spent so much of his career operating at a particular frequency of intensity, that famous singular, barely contained wildness that has made him both beloved and endlessly memed, that we sometimes forget what he can do when he is asked to be genuinely vulnerable. And Grug, beneath all the physical comedy and the bluster and the very funny territorial displays, is a vulnerable character. He's a man who laughs too hard and holds too tight and knows, somewhere beneath all that grip strength, that holding tight is exactly the wrong response to a world that keeps changing. Cage finds that vulnerability and does not play it for laughs. He plays it straight. He plays it with a rawness that, in a film aimed partly at children, is surprisingly affecting. That is a scene, and I will not fully detail it yet because we are still in pre-spoiler territory where Lucas, to reckon with the specific shape of his sphere, has to look at it directly rather than through the comfortable proxy of action and noise. And in that moment, Cage's voice does something very quiet and very real. It does not perform grief, it simply holds it. That is the scene that proves what this performance is made of. Emma Stone as Eve carries the emotional center of this film with a likeness that disguises how much work she is doing. Eve is not a simple character even though she could easily have been written as one. She's caught between two gravitational pulls, the family she loves with a physical, bone-deep loyalty, and the future she is building with Guy, a future that exists just slightly outside the world her parents can fully understand. Stone gives Eve a quality that is genuinely rare in animated heroines. She is enthusiastic without being naive. She is brave without being naive. She is brave without being reckless. And in the specific dynamic between Eve and Dawn, the Betterman daughter, voiced by Kelly Marie Tran in a warm and effortless performance, Stone finds something that the script is genuinely trying to say about female friendship. There is a particular quality to Eve's joy when she realizes that Dawn is her friend, not a rival, not a complication, just a friend, that feels true in a way that the film earns rather than assumes. The relationship between Eve and Dawn is the emotional surprise of this film, and Stone is a large part of why it works. Ryan Reynolds as Guy is, if I am being honest, the most contested performance in the film. Reynolds does what Reynolds does. He is charming, he is quick, he is alive in a way that makes every scene he is in feel slightly more energized. But Guy's emotional journey in this film, and it is the most significant interior journey of any character here, occasionally gets smoothed over by Reynolds' natural tendency toward wit. There are moments where Guy needs to be genuinely lost, genuinely frightened by what the Bettermans are offering him and what it would mean to accept it. And in those moments, Reynolds sometimes reaches for the joke when the scene is asking for the wound. It is not a performance without depth. It is a performance that sometimes chooses comfort over difficulty. And given how much of the film's emotional architecture rests on Guy's internal conflict, that occasional retreat into wit leaves a small but real gap at the story's core. Peter Dinklage as Phil Betterman is an absolute revelation. I want to be clear about this because I think it is genuinely underappreciated. Dinklage takes what could have been a one-note antagonist, the too polished, too comfortable foil to Grug's rough-edged authenticity, and turns him into something far more interesting. Phil Betterman has a dignity about him that never quite tips into pomposity. He has a warmth that never quite tips into manipulation. He is a man who has built a beautiful life and is offering it generously, and who cannot quite understand why that generosity keeps being refused. Dinklage plays that performance with a lightness that is enormously funny and, in the film's quieter moments, quietly heartbreaking. The specific comedy of Phil and Grug circling each other are two alpha males from entirely different evolutionary stages of human development trying to assert dominance over the same patch of symbolic territory is some of the funniest material in the film, and it works as well as it does because Dinklage is playing it with complete sincerity. He's never winking at the camera. He's fully present in every absurd moment, and that commitment is what makes the absurdity land. Leslie Mann as Hope Betterman brings a particular feminine intelligence to the film that I think goes relatively undiscussed. Hope is the more emotionally perceptive of the two Bettermans. She sees more clearly what is happening around her. She understands the Croods faster than Phil does and is in certain moments more willing to admit what she does not know. Mann plays her with a careful mixture of control and warmth. A woman who has built her world with great intention and is not entirely sure what to do when that world is disrupted by people who have never heard of intention as a concept. There is a specific quality to Hope's expression. Not cruelty, never cruelty, just the mild, ongoing bafflement of someone who has organized their life very carefully, discovering that other people simply have not. That Maine delivers, with perfect comedic timing and, in the right moments, genuine emotional generosity. And Cloris Leachman as Gran. And I want to spend a moment here because Gran is the film's great comedic wild card, a character who exists partly to create chaos, partly to provide a certain ancient, unkillable energy to the proceedings, and Leachman, who passed away in February of 2021, delivers her performance with a relish and a specificity that is genuinely joyful to experience. Gran is not a deep character. The film does not ask her to be. But what the film asks is that she be completely unstoppably herself in every scene she inhabits, and Ditchman delivers that with such warm and committed energy that you find yourself smiling simply at the sound of her voice. It is a performance that understands its own function in the ecosystem of the film and fulfills that function with tremendous grace. Now let us talk about the writing, because the screenplay of The Croods, A New Age is a complicated document, genuinely complicated, and I want to be precise about what that means. It is not complicated in the way that a structurally ambitious film is complicated. It is complicated in the way that a film written by several people trying to serve several different goals simultaneously is complicated. There are moments in this screenplay that are simply beautifully written, moments where a line of dialogue lands with the kind of quiet precision that makes you feel something without quite knowing why. And there are moments where the screenplay is doing very obvious work in very obvious ways, where you can feel the gears of plot turning just beneath the surface of the scene, where characters say things not because those things would naturally be said, but because the story needs them said. The best writing in this film is almost always in the spaces between the comedy. It is in the moment where Grug, standing in a place he does not belong, says something that is ostensibly funny, but contains embedded inside the joke a real and aching truth about what it means to feel inadequate beside someone who has more. The screenplay has a genuine intelligence about class, about the specific discomfort of being in a space that is designed, even generously, to make you feel less than. The Bettermans' treehouse is not a weapon. Phil and Hope are not wielding their comfort cruelly, but the Croods feel it none the less. They feel the weight of all that cleanliness and odor and soft light. They feel it in their bodies, and the screenplay is smart enough to let that feeling be present without over-explaining it. It trusts the audience to recognize a truth they have likely lived. The scene I keep returning to, the scene that I think best demonstrates what this screenplay is capable of at its most intelligent, is the scene between Grug and Guy that happens quietly, away from the main action, when the story has built enough pressure that two people who love the same person have to look at each other honestly. It is not a long scene, it is not a scene with particularly complex dialogue, but it earns every one of its seconds because the writing understands that the most truthful conversations between fathers and the young men who love their daughters are not arguments. They are not negotiations, they are two people simultaneously trying to protect the same person and slowly realizing that protection requires different things from each of them. I will say more about this scene in the spoiler section, where I can fully describe what happens in it. But here in craft terms, what I want to note is this. The screenwriters found the emotional core of their story and placed it correctly. Not at the climax, not in the big action sequence, but in a quiet moment between two characters who have stopped performing for each other. That is the mark of genuine craft. There is also something the writing does with the theme of progress that I find genuinely interesting and underexplored in most discussions of this film. The Croods' A New Age is, at one level, a film about the tension between a prehistoric family and a slightly less prehistoric family, a comedy of evolutionary stages, you might say. But what the screenplay is actually interrogating is something much more contemporary. It is asking whether progress, the accumulation of comfort, the building of better shelter, the cultivation of duty and ease, and the small luxuries of a life organized rather than survived, whether progress necessarily produces better people. The Bettermans have more. They have organized more. They have built more. And yet the film does not present them as wiser or kinder or more evolved in any meaningful human sense. What they have is different, not superior. And that distinction, that quiet, careful refusal to equate material progress with human worth, is one of the more mature ideas in the film, and it is woven into the screenplay with enough lightness that you might not notice it consciously. But it is working on you, it is doing something. Now the visual language. This is where the Croods in Image truly distinguishes itself, and I think it is the area most consistently underserved by quick reviews that mention the animation is pretty and move on. The animation in this film is not merely pretty. It is doing specific, intentional, emotionally precise work in almost every sequence, and understanding what it is doing changes how you experience the film. The world of the Croods has always been defined by its color palette, deep, saturated, almost hallucinatory hues that feel less like representations of a real prehistoric world and more like the emotional temperature of the story being told. The original Croods was drenched in warm reds and burnt oranges, the colors of a world that is dangerous and unknown but also, despite itself, alive. The new age of the sequel introduces something different. The Betterman estate is rendered in cooler, more organized tones, the blues and greens of cultivated order, of a world that has been shaped by human will rather than simply inhabited by it. This contrast is not accidental. Every time we shift between the wild, chaotic landscapes where the Croods feel most themselves and the structured, beautiful geometry of the Betterman world, we are being shown a visual argument. We are being shown two different ideas about what safety looks like and what it costs. The two shots that stay with me most powerfully are both relatively quiet by the film's own standards of spectacle. The first is a shot of Grug standing at the edge of the Betterman garden, looking out, looking beyond the walls at the open, unknowable, dangerous world beyond them, a world that has always been his natural element, and the composition places him exactly at the threshold. Half inside the protected beauty of the garden, half turned toward the wilderness, he has always navigated by instinct. It is a single unhurried image that contains the entire emotional thesis of the film. The second shot, and this one I will hold for the spoiler section, involves Guy in a moment of genuine revelation, and the way the light changes around him in that moment is one of the most quietly beautiful pieces of visual storytelling in the film. It is a choice that requires no dialogue and no explanation. It simply shows you what he feels in color, in the quality of the air around him. Joel Crawford, directing his first feature, shows a confidence with camera placement and composition that would not be possible from someone who had not spent years in the studio learning how animators speak visually. There is a particular quality to the way he frames the Croods in group shots, always slightly chaotic, slightly overlapping, always suggesting the particular density of a family that has never learned to give each other space, versus the way he frames the Bettermans, who occupy their shots with a deliberate, almost architectural separateness that tells you everything about how they have learned to love, with space, with structure, with beautiful and slightly cold consideration for each other's autonomy. That is visual characterization of a very high order. The physical comedy sequences in this film are choreographed with a precision that deserves its own conversation. The great action comedies of animation, and there is a lineage here, from the Roadrunner cartoons through the best sequences of Kung Fu Panda, work because they understand that physical comedy is not just about what happens, but about the rhythm in which it happens. The timing of a fall, the pause before an impact, the specific way a body occupies space in the instant before chaos. These are all choices and they are all craft. The sequences in the Croods and New Age that involve the Betterman animals, and I will say no more about them here, except that they are genuinely one of the great comic inventions in recent DreamWorks Animation, are constructed with a timing and a spatial intelligence that is a genuine pleasure to watch frame by frame. Crawford and his animation team understand that the funniest version of a joke is never the loudest version. It is the most precisely timed version. And this film is in its comedy sequences very precisely timed indeed. Let me turn now to the score and the sound design, because both are doing work in this film that tends to go unremarked and should not. Magma Daswa composed the score for the Croods and New Age, as he did for the original, and what he brings to this sequel is both a continuity with the first film's musical identity and a set of new themes that reflect the expanded emotional landscape of the story. The Mother's Bus score for these films exists in a particular space between adventure music and something more intimate. It has the sweep and energy required to support the film's big physical sequences, but it also has a chamber music delicacy that emerges in the quieter emotional moments. What I find most interesting about the score is the way it handles the recurring motif associated with Guy. In the first film, Guy's musical identity was tied to ideas of discovery and forward motion, bright questing phrases that felt like someone looking at the horizon. In this film, that same basic musical DNA is present, but Mother Spark introduces something new alongside it, a slightly more melancholy undertone, a note of something unresolved, that surfaces most clearly in the scenes where Guy is navigating his complicated feelings about the Bettermans and what they represent. It is subtle, it is never labeled, but it is there, and it is doing precise emotional work beneath the surface of the scene. What this film also understands, and what I think marks Mothersbaugh as a genuinely thoughtful composer for animated cinema, is the value of silence. Not the absence of music exactly, but the deliberate duration of spaces, where the emotional weight of a scene is carried by sound design rather than score. The texture of the word in the Croods. A new age is rich, the organic hum of the Betterman garden, the particular wildness of the prehistoric landscapes beyond the walls, the strange layered sounds of creatures that have never existed, and in the moments where the score pulls back and lets that texture breathe, the film achieves something that pure musical underscore cannot. It achieves presence, the feeling that you are in this world, not watching it from outside. There is one specific moment in the film where silence is used as pure, clean narrative punctuation, and I want to note it without giving away the context. There is a beat, perhaps 3 seconds long, between two characters who have just understood something about each other that changes everything, where Mothersbaugh makes the choice to let the scene exist in complete quiet, no music, minimal sound design, just the weight of two people in a shared moment of recognition. It is 3 seconds, maybe four, but those seconds land with a force that a full orchestral swell could not have produced. That is the craft of knowing when to put the instrument down. Now let us speak honestly about where this film falls short, because it does fall short in several places, and those shortcomings are worth understanding, not to diminish what the film achieves, but to see it clearly. The most significant flaw in the Croods. A New Age is a pacing problem in the second act that is structural rather than incidental, meaning it is not a problem of a single slow scene, but of how the story's middle section is organized. After the initial establishment of the Betterman dynamic, the film enters a phase where it is trying to do too many things at once: develop the Eep and Dawn friendship, advance the Guy and Betterman backstory, maintain the Grug and Phil comedy rivalry, and begin the process of setting up the film's third act conflict. The result is a section of the film that feels dispersed rather than focused, where our attention is being pulled in several directions simultaneously, and none of the threads receives quite enough sustained development to build real momentum. You feel the screenplay making choices about what to prioritize and being slightly uncertain about those choices. The Gluck and Phil rivalry, which could have developed into something more emotionally complex, gets resolved primarily through comedy and physical escalation. The gay backstory, which is the emotional engine of the entire film, gets deferred perhaps too long. And the relationship between Aga and Hope, which has genuine potential to be its own fascinating strand of the story, two women from different worlds finding an unexpected mutual recognition, is underwritten to the point of feeling like a missed opportunity. This connects to a broader issue with the screenplay's ambition relative to its execution. The Croods, A New Age is trying to tell at least three stories simultaneously. A story about a father learning to let go, a story about a young man learning to accept where he came from, and a story about two families learning that their differences are less important than their shared need for connection. Any one of these stories fully developed would be a rich and satisfying film. All three, partially developed, creates a film that is emotionally generous but sometimes thematically thin. You feel the themes more as gestures toward meaning than as fully inhabited truths. Which is not to say they do not land, some of them land beautifully. But you sometimes sense the frame of the idea more clearly than you feel the idea itself. The treatment of Thunk and Gran in this film is a gentle but real limitation. Like Dukes, Thunk has a subplot involving the discovery of what is essentially a window, and the film's commentary on screen addiction and passive entertainment is genuinely funny and occasionally surprisingly pointed. but the subplot exists primarily for comedy and never quite earns a place in the emotional architecture of the story. Ran, as I noted in the performance section, is gloriously man, delivering tremendous energy to a role that the screenplay has not given enough actually interiority to justify all that energy. These are characters who existed richly in the first film and are here somewhat reduced to functional supporting players in a story that has outgrown their designated space. It is not a fatal flaw, but it is a narrowing. There is also a tonal inconsistency in the film's third act that I want to address because it is the most cinematically disruptive of the film's weaknesses. The third act escalates into a sequence of action and physical spectacle that is in itself extremely well executed, visually inventive, funny, energetically sustained. But it arrives at a moment when the film has just begun to reach its deepest emotional territory, and the shift in register from intimate to spectacular feels slightly like a retreat. As though the film has built to a point of genuine emotional exposure and then chosen, not quite at the last second but close to it, to cover that exposure with noise and movement. The emotional resolution that follows the spectacle is genuine and earned, but it arrives having been somewhat preceded by a deflection, and you feel that deflection even if you cannot quite name it while it is happening. None of these are wounds that break the film. They are the marks of a film that was reaching for something bigger than its final shape allowed it to achieve, and that reaching is itself honorable. A film that falls short of its ambitions is almost always more interesting than a film that achieves everything it sets out to do because its ambitions were small enough to guarantee success. The Croods know it reaches. It does not always catch what it reaches for, but the reaching matters and it produces, in its best moments, something genuinely worth having. Now let us talk about how this film came to exist. Because the development of the Croods, A New Age is a more interesting story than you might expect, and understanding it reshapes how you see several choices the film makes. The original Croods was released in 2013 and was by almost any measure a success. It earned approximately $587 million globally on a production budget of approximately $135 million, received reasonably strong reviews, and demonstrated that DreamWorks Animation had genuine affection for this family and this world beyond their commercial value. A sequel was announced relatively quickly, which is standard practice for successful animated franchises, and initially a release was planned for 2017. But the sequel spent several years in a complicated development process, one that involved multiple script passes, changes in creative direction, and the significant disruption caused by the corporate upheaval at DreamWorks Animation following its acquisition by NBC Universal. The studio was in a period of genuine structural uncertainty during those years, and the Crude sequel reflected that uncertainty in its extended gestation. What ultimately emerged from that process, with Joel Crawford taking over as director after the project had passed through several hands, was a film that bears the marks of its complicated development in both its strengths and its weaknesses. The thematic ambition, the genuine emotional intelligence about family and change, and the anxiety of progress, these feel like ideas that survived and deepened through multiple drafts. The occasional looseness of the second act, the slightly underdeveloped supporting arts, these feel like the scars of a development process that had to make compromises to arrive at a coherent final film. Crawford has spoken in interviews about the challenge of inheriting a project with so much prior history and making it genuinely his own, and the confidence and visual specificity of his direction suggests that he succeeded at that challenge more thoroughly than the development story might have predicted. Joel Crawford himself is a fascinating figure in the context of this film. Before taking the helm of A New Age as a feature director, Crawford had worked at DreamWorks in various animation and story capacities for years. He was deeply embedded in the studio's culture, its visual language, its way of developing and executing animated narrative. The directorial voice he brings to this film is not the voice of an outsider given a chance, but of someone who has spent a long time absorbing how these films work and has finally been given the space to demonstrate what he would do with them. There is a fluency to his direction that first-time feature directors rarely possess, and it serves the film enormously. He knows how to talk to his animators. He knows how to use the camera as an emotional instrument. And he knows, crucially, when to get out of the way of a performance and simply let it exist. Here is one of the things about this production that I find genuinely reshapes how I look at a specific moment in the film, the Punch Monkeys. The bizarre, chaotic, brilliantly rendered primates who become a significant comic and narrative element in the film's second half were apparently a late addition to the screenplay, a creative solution to a story problem involving the third act that required a wildcard element of energy and unpredictability. The fact that they were a solution rather than an origin point is fascinating because they feel absolutely essential to the film's rhythm in retrospect. The specific comedy of the Punch Monkeys, the particular way they exist simultaneously as threat and as gag, creates a tonal bridge between the film's domestic comedy and its adventure escalation that the story needed and that apparently was not originally planned. When you know this, you look at the Punch Monkey sequences differently. You see them not as simple comic relief, but as a creative act of narrative improvisation that the filmmakers found necessary and then executed with tremendous commitment. The production was also shaped significantly by the particular challenge of continuing the visual world of the original film while expanding it in ways that felt organic, rather than merely bigger. The DreamWorks Animation team spent considerable time developing the aesthetic of the Betterman estate. What a slightly more advanced prehistoric civilization might actually look like if rendered in the hyper-real, maximally saturated visual language of this franchise. The treehouse, in particular, went through many iterations before arriving at its final form. A structure that needed to feel genuinely impressive, genuinely lived in, and genuinely out of reach of the Croods, without ever tipping into a fantasy of comfort that felt anachronistic. The organic materials, the specific textures of cultivated versus wild space, the way the light moves differently inside the Betterman world versus outside it, these details were painstakingly built across many months of visual development, and they pay off in the specificity and believability of the world as you experience it. One of the things that also shaped the production significantly was the decision to expand the female relationships in the story beyond what the original film had offered. The friendship between Eve and Dawn was not, according to Crawford and the screenwriters, the original center of the story, but as the development process continued, it became increasingly clear that this relationship was generating more genuine emotional energy than several other story elements that had been given more initial prominence. The filmmakers made the conscious choice to lean into it, to give it more screen time and more genuine development, and the result is one of the film's most reliably warm and emotionally true elements. That is a production choice that required confidence, the confidence to recognize mid-development where the real story was living and to reorganize around it rather than persisting with the original plan. The film was also, of course, shaped by a release context that no one had planned for. The Croods: A New Age was originally scheduled for a standard theatrical release in late 2020, but the ongoing global pandemic complicated theatrical distribution enormously. The film received a shortened theatrical window before becoming available on premium video on demand services, a release strategy that affected its commercial performance and its cultural footprint in ways that are worth examining in the next part of this essay when we turn to how the world received it. What I want to note here in the context of production is that the pandemic release did something specific to how this film was experienced by its audience, and that specificity matters. A film about two families being forced to inhabit the same space, to negotiate coexistence, to discover that the other family, however different, contains genuine love and genuine humanity, arrived at a moment when millions of families around the world were being forced, in various ways, to renegotiate their own domestic arrangements, to rediscover what they needed from each other, to sit with the particular friction and tenderness of prolonged proximity. I do not think the film was designed with that resonance in mind. It could not have been. But the resonance is real, and it shaped how many people experienced the film in ways that a traditional theatrical release would not have generated. There is one final production detail I want to share with you before we move forward, because it genuinely changes how I see a specific element of the finished film. Leslie Mann, who voices Gran, recorded her performance for this film when she was already in her 90s. She passed away at 94, just a few months after the film's release, and knowing that you listen to Gran's voice differently, there is an energy there. A wild, uncontainable, absolutely present energy that belongs to someone who has lived so fully and so long that they have no more patience left for anything other than complete authenticity. Gran is a character not explaining herself, does not justify herself, does not modulate herself for anyone's comfort. She simply is. And Lichman's performance contains all of that. It contains the particular freedom of someone who has earned, through sheer duration, the right to be exactly themselves. When you know the context, the performance becomes something more than a comic turn. It becomes a kind of gift. A last gorgeous, completely unself-conscious act of creative presence from someone who gave this world a great deal of presence over a very long and extraordinary career. Let us now turn to how the world received this film. Because the story of the Croods, a new age in the world, its commercial life, its critical reception, its complicated relationship with the moment it arrived into, is a story that tells you something important, not just about this film, but about the particular vulnerabilities of animated cinema in a cultural landscape that was, in late 2020, being reshaped by forces that no studio executive had included in any release strategy document. The film opened in theaters in the United States on the 25th of November 2020, Thanksgiving weekend, one of the most historically significant release windows in American cinema, a slot traditionally reserved for films with confidence in their audience and their commercial potential. Universal and DreamWorks placed their Croods a new age, there deliberately, understanding that the holiday family audience was one of the few reliably large demographics that still had reason to visit a cinema in the middle of a global pandemic, or more precisely, would have had reason to visit one in a normal year. But 2020 was not a normal year in any sense, and the theatrical landscape into which this film arrived was not the theatrical landscape anyone had planned for. Many major cinema chains were operating at reduced capacity or were closed entirely in significant markets. The culture of theatrical film-going, the specific shared, communal experience of sitting with strangers in a dark room and allowing a story to wash over you collectively, had been profoundly disrupted. And so, The Croods, a new age, opened to a domestic box office of approximately $14 million over the extended Thanksgiving weekend, a number that, in any normal release context, would have been a significant disappointment for a wide-release animated sequel from a major studio. But in the context of late 2020, in the context of what theatrical exhibition actually looked like in that moment, it was something closer to a small miracle. It was the highest grossing wide release of the pandemic era to that point. It was a signal that audiences, given even the limited opportunity, still wanted to gather around a story. The international performance was more complicated and more interesting. In markets where theatrical exhibition had recovered more substantially, China in particular, where the film opened to approximately $23 million in its opening weekend and eventually accumulated a significant portion of its global total, The Croods, a new age, demonstrated that its appeal was genuinely international, that the particular emotional language it was speaking translated across cultural contexts with relative ease. The film's final global theatrical total was approximately $170 million, a number that tells a somewhat misleading story about the film's actual commercial significance, because it does not account for the premium video on demand revenue that accompanied the theatrical release or the streaming performance that followed. Because here is what actually happened with the commercial life of this film. Universal made the decision in the middle of the theatrical run to make the film available on premium video on demand platforms, initially for $49, a price point that was itself the subject of considerable discussion and some controversy among both consumers and theater chains. The premium VOD strategy was a response to the pandemic realities of limited theatrical access. but it had the effect of creating a dual-track release in which the film was simultaneously a theatrical experience and a domestic streaming event. And in the domestic streaming context, The Croods and New Age performed extraordinarily well. It became one of the most watched premium boot releases of the entire pandemic period. Families who could not or would not visit a cinema found the film through their living room screens, and the specific qualities that made this film work, its warmth, its comedy, its genuine emotional accessibility, proved, if anything, more effective in the domestic context than they might have been in a cinema. This is a film that invites closeness. It invites the particular dynamic of watching something together on a sofa, of sharing a laugh in the same physical space as someone you love, of reaching for someone's hand during a moment that is unexpectedly, quietly moving. The pandemic living room, strange and stressful as it was, turned out to be a near perfect context for what this film was offering. The subsequent streaming life of The Croods and New Age has been substantial. The film moved to various streaming platforms in the months following its theatrical and premium VOD release, and on those platforms it has found the second wave audience that many animated films depend upon for their cultural legacy. Families discovering it for the first time, children re-watching it with the kind of repetitive notion that is one of the great pleasures and occasional challenges of being the parent of a young person who has found a film they love. On Netflix, which held streaming rights in certain markets, it consistently ranked among the most watched titles in its category. This streaming longevity matters. It is the difference between a film that was seen and a film that became part of people's lives, part of the ongoing domestic texture of family viewing. And The Croods A New Age, whatever its critical reception might suggest, has achieved exactly that kind of domestic permanence in a way that speaks well of what it is actually offering its audience. The critical response was, I think it is fair to say, warmer than the film's reputation among more serious film discourse might suggest, and cooler than its audience reception would imply. On the major aggregator sites, the film settled into a range of scores that reflect a genuine critical appreciation for its craft and visual ambition, alongside a measured acknowledgement of its structural and thematic limitations. Most reviews that engaged seriously with the film found something genuine to celebrate alongside something genuine to question, which is precisely the critical response that a film of this particular nature deserves. The reviews that bothered me, and I am choosing that word deliberately, were the ones that treated the film's qualities as though they were accidental, as though a DreamWorks animated sequel could not possibly have been made with genuine artistic intention, and therefore any evidence of genuine artistic intention must be explained away. That critical condescension toward animated family cinema is a bias I have little patience for, and it showed up in a handful of responses to this film that seemed more invested in maintaining a hierarchy of cinematic seriousness than in actually engaging with what was on screen. The audience response, measured through the various audience scoring mechanisms available to us, was consistently warmer than the critical consensus. Families who saw the film, particularly families who saw it together in the domestic context of the pandemic VOD release, reported a level of emotional engagement and genuine enjoyment that exceeded what the critical conversation would have predicted. This divergence between critical and audience response is itself interesting and worth a moment of consideration. Critics watching a film in professional isolation with the full weight of cinematic context and comparative expectation bearing down on their assessment and measuring the film against everything that came before it. Audiences watching a film in the particular context of their own lives and relationships are measuring it against something more immediate and more personal. Does this say something true? Does it make me feel something real? Does it give me a way to be with the people I love for an hour and a half in a way that leaves us all slightly better than we were before? The Croods A New Age answers those questions more consistently and more honestly than its critical reception fully acknowledges, and I think that is worth saying directly, without apology. In terms of awards recognition, the film's release context complicated its awards trajectory in ways that are somewhat difficult to fully separate from questions of merit. The 2021 awards season, covering films released in 2020, was itself a highly unusual landscape. The pandemic had disrupted the normal rhythms of screener distribution, critical momentum building, and the social machinery through which awards consideration typically accumulates. The Croods: A New Age received a Golden Globe nomination for Best Animated Feature Film, which placed it in the correct conversation and acknowledged its legitimacy as a significant animated work of its year. It did not win. The award went elsewhere in a year that contained some genuinely extraordinary animated work, but the nomination itself was a signal from the awards community that this film was not to be dismissed. What the film deserved and did not receive was more recognition for its visual achievement. The animation, the color, the composition, the sheer technical ambition of building and populating a world of this specificity and beauty represents some of the finest work DreamWorks Animation has produced in the post How to Train Your Dragon era, and the absence of stronger technical awards recognition for that work is a gap that the passage of time has not entirely filled. The animation community knows this film's quality at the craft level. The broader awards conversation, distracted by the noise of an extraordinary pandemic year, did not fully catch up. Now let us step back. Let us step back from the numbers and the reception and the context, and let us ask the larger question. Let us ask where this film stands in the story of which it is a part. The Croods: A New Age is the second film in what is, at the time of this essay, a two-film franchise, though a third film has been in various stages of development discussion, and given the commercial and streaming performance of the first two, it seems reasonable to expect that the Croods family will return to screens in some form. But what I want to do here is not speculate about what comes next. I want to look at what the second film adds to what the first film built, because that relationship, the specific nature of how a sequel inhabits the world established by its predecessor, is one of the most revealing measures of a franchise's genuine artistic ambition. The original Croods, released in 2013 and directed by Keir Demico and Chris Sanders, is a film with a very clear and very effectively executed central idea, a story about a father who defines safety as the absence of change, and what happens when change arrives in a form he cannot refuse. Grug in the original film is a creature of pure protective instinct, a man who has kept his family alive through absolute risk aversion, and who is being asked, by the arrival of Guy and by the emergence of his daughter into her own desires and agency, to reconsider the entire value system he has built his survival upon. The original film resolves this beautifully and honestly. Grug does not become someone different. He becomes a fuller version of who he already was. He discovers that his instinct for protection can expand beyond the cape, beyond the control and the known, into something that looks more like trust and feels more like love. It is a simple story told with genuine emotional integrity, and it works because it commits fully to its central relationship and follows it to its honest conclusion. What the Croods: A New Age does, and this is, I think, its most significant contribution to the franchise as a whole, is refuse the easy sequel move of simply resetting and repeating. It would have been straightforward and commercially sensible to build a second film that puts Scrooge in a new situation, requiring the same lesson he learned in the first film, delivered once more with new jokes and new creatures and a new landscape. Many animated sequels take exactly that path, but A New Age looks at where the first film left Grug and asks, what does a man who has already learned one hard lesson still not know? What is the next lesson? And the next lesson, it turns out, is harder than the first. The first lesson was about letting the world in. The second lesson is about letting people go. And that distinction between opening yourself to the world and releasing the people you love into it is the difference between a sequel that recycles and a sequel that deepens. Here's what I mean by that. In the first film, Grook's challenge is fundamentally about his own psychology, about his own fear, his own resistance, his own unwillingness to see the world as anything other than a threat. The work he has to do is internal. He has to change his mind. In the second film, Grook has already changed his mind, or at least he has changed it as much as he is capable of changing it within the safety of the family unit. The challenge of the second film is not about Grook's psychology in isolation. It is about Grook's psychology in relationship, specifically in relationship to Guy, who is not simply a young man his daughter loves, but a young man who represents everything Grug cannot give Eve: a future, a direction, a life that begins where the Croods' world ends. The second film asks, can a father love his child enough to stop being the most important person in her life? Can he make himself smaller so that she can be larger? That is a more nuanced and in some ways more painful question than the first film asks, and the fact that A New Age is brave enough to ask it is what elevates it, in my view, above the level of mere competent sequel. The relationship between the two films also works at the level of Guy's character, and this is where the sequel most clearly justifies its own existence. In the original Croods, he is essentially a catalyst, a functioning Grug story as much as a character in his own right. He is the representative of tomorrow, the embodiment of change, the young man who arrives and disrupts a closed system into openness. His personal history, the loss of his family, the specific grief that has shaped him is present but not fully explored. The first film needed Guy as a force, not a person. The second film makes him a person. It takes the grief that was background in the first film and brings it to the foreground. It asks what it means to move toward the future when the past is always just behind you. It asks whether optimism, that particular effortful, almost defiant optimism that Guy has always represented, can coexist with genuine mourning. Whether you can be the person who faces the horizon and also the person who looks back. That question could not have been asked in the first film because the first film had not yet established enough of Guy to make it meaningful. The second film has earned the right to ask it, and the asking is one of its most honest achievements. What A New Age adds to the larger conversation of the franchise is this: it takes the world of the first film, already warm, already emotionally genuine, and gives it integrity. It gives the characters a past that shapes the present in ways we can feel rather than simply understand intellectually. It introduces through the Bettermans a second family that functions as a mirror, showing the Croods what they are by contrast and showing the audience that every family, however different its surface, is organized around the same essential questions of love and fear and the difficulty of holding both simultaneously. And it suggests in its ending that the next chapter of this story, whatever form it takes, will be about what happens when two families who were once opposed become improbably and generously something like one. That is a rich and genuinely interesting foundation for what might come next. And it is the mark of a sequel that has not just continued a story but genuinely expanded the world it takes place in. There is also something worth saying about what a second film does with the visual and tonal identity of the franchise. The original Croods has a slightly grittier, slightly more primitive visual quality. It is a film that earned its warmth, that started in darkness and moved toward light. The sequel arrives with more color, more invention, more willingness to be strange and beautiful, and maximally saturated in every frame. Some critics read this as inflation, as the natural tendency of sequels to amplify everything that worked in the original until the amplification itself becomes a form of distortion. And there is something to that criticism, but I think there is also something else happening. The visual expansion of the sequel reflects its thematic expansion. The first film is a story about survival. The second film is a story about living, and living, truly living, in all its color and mess and abundance and conflict, looks different from surviving. The world of A New Age is bigger and stranger and more beautiful because the characters in it have moved beyond the question of whether they will exist and into the harder, richer question of how they will exist. The animation is not inflated, it is matured. It is what the world looks like when fear is no longer the primary lens through which it is experienced. Now let us go deeper. Let us leave the surface of the story and go underneath it, because that is where the film's true life is, in the emotional and thematic currents that run beneath every scene and every joke and every frame of extraordinary animation. Let us ask what the Croods in New Age is really saying. At its deepest level, this is a film about the terror and the necessity of change. Not change as an abstract good, not the optimistic, horizon-facing, tomorrow-championing version of change that Guy represented in the first film, but change as a lived, specific, sometimes grievous experience. Change as the thing that takes people you love and moves them to a place you cannot fully follow. Change as the gap that opens between the person you have been and the person you are being asked to become. Every major character in this film is navigating some version of that gap, and the film's emotional intelligence lies in its refusal to make any of those navigations easy or cost free. Grug's gap is the one the film is most explicit about, the gap between the father he has been protective, central, indispensable, the first and last word on every question of safety and direction, and the father he is being asked to become, which is a father who trusts his daughter's choices even when those choices lead her away from him. This is not a new theme in family films. The anxiety of a parent losing a child to adulthood is one of the oldest and most reliable emotional wells in animated cinema. What makes Group's version of it interesting is the specific texture of his resistance. He is not a bad father trying to be a good one. He is a genuinely great father, devoted, brave, sacrificial, completely present, who has to learn that the greatest act of love he can perform for his daughter is one that will feel from the inside like a failure. Letting go does not feel like love when you are the one letting go. It feels like loss. It feels like defeat. It feels like the last enemy has won, and the film is honest about that. It does not pretend that Grove's journey arrives at easy peace. It arrives at something more complicated and more true, a kind of willing grief, a love that has made enough space inside itself to hold both the desire to keep and the willingness to release. Abe's gap is quieter and in some ways more interesting, because the film gives her less explicit acknowledgement of the difficulty she is navigating. Eve is the character who, on the surface, appears to be the most certain of her direction. She knows what she wants, she goes toward it. She is the daughter who found her future before the story even began. But what a New Age reviews about Eve is that certainty about direction does not eliminate anxiety about what you leave behind. The friendship with Dawn is the key to understanding this. Eve has never had a friend outside her family. She has never had a relationship that was chosen rather than given, and the specific quality of her joy in Dawn's friendship, the rawness of it, the almost desperate gratitude of it, tells you something about what has been missing. Eve is not simply a girl who has found love and is trying to bring her family along. She is a girl who is discovering, for the first time, what it means to have a self that exists independent of the family that defined her. Dawn is not just a friend. Dawn is a mirror that shows Eve who she might be when she is not being someone's daughter. Guy's Gap is the most interior and, I would argue, the most cinematically underserved of the three, though the film reaches for it with genuine ambition. What Guy is navigating in this film is nothing less than the reconciliation of his past and his future, the specific painful work of integrating the loss of his family of origin with the new family he is building, the understanding that moving toward tomorrow does not require abandoning the weight of what was lost. The Bettermans offer him a specific thing, a door back into the before, into the time when his parents were alive and the world was different and he was not yet the boy who survived and the young man who always looked forward. And the film asks very honestly whether opening that door is brave or foolish. Whether letting yourself feel what you have worked so hard not to feel is the thing that heals you or the thing that reopens the wound. Guy's resolution of the question is the emotional heart of the film's final movement, and I will speak about it more fully in the spoiler section. But here, in thematic terms, what I want to say is this. The Croods, a new age, understands something about grief that animated family films rarely attempt to address. It understands that grief does not have a clear endpoint, that you do not finish grieving and then proceed into your life. You carry the grief with you into the life, and the life changes the grief, and the grief changes the life, and the relationship between them is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be inhabited. Guy has been inhabiting his grief for the entirety of both films. He have been doing it with such practiced ease, such cheerful forward momentum, that the audience and the characters around him might not even have noticed. A new age notices. It looks at Guy's relentless optimism and asks with great gentleness, whether optimism is always strength or whether it is sometimes a very elegant and well maintained way of not looking at what hurts you most. The theme of class and comfort is one I raised earlier in the context of the screenplay, but I want to return to it here in its thematic fullness because it is one of the most quietly radical things about this film and one of the most consistently under acknowledged. The Bettermans are not presented as villains, but they are presented very precisely and with genuine thematic intention as the beneficiaries of a certain kind of progress that has costs the beneficiaries themselves cannot always see. The Betterman estate is beautiful, the Betterman life is comfortable, and that comfort has produced, in Phil and Hope, a certain unexamined confidence about the right way to do things, about what good food looks like, and what a good home looks like, and what a good home looks like, and what a good future for a young man looks like. They are not cruel in their assumptions, they are not consciously condescending. They simply have not had to examine their assumptions because their assumptions have always been confirmed by the world they have built around them. The Croods, who have survived in chaos and built their identity entirely in opposition to comfort and ease, carry a different kind of knowledge. They know things the Bettermans do not know. They know how to navigate danger. They know how to hold each other through catastrophe. They know in their bodies and their bones that the world is not safe and that the only real shelter is the love of the people around you. This is not presented as superior to the Betterman knowledge. It is presented as different, as complementary, as the missing piece of a larger understanding that neither family can access alone, and that framing the refusal to declare a winner between comfort and vitality, between cultivation and wildness, between the organized life and the survived life is, I think, one of the most genuinely democratic things about this film. It says that what we need from each other is not confirmation of our own way of being, but the perspective of someone who has built a completely different way of being and still arrived at the same essential values: protect your family, love your children, hold the people you love when the world gets too dark to navigate alone. There is also a motif in this film that I want to draw your attention to, because I think it is operating throughout the story at a level just beneath conscious awareness, and it enriches the film considerably when you see it clearly. The motif is doors and thresholds. This film is obsessed quietly, persistently, in ways both obvious and subtle, with the imagery of standing at a threshold. Characters are constantly at the edges of things, at the edge of the garden, at the edge of the known world, at the edge of a decision they are not quite ready to make, at the edge of saying the thing they have been not saying for too long. The walled garden itself is the film's central spatial metaphor, a paradise that is also a container, a place of beauty that is also a place of limitation, a home that is also a boundary. The wall that surrounds the Betterman estate is not simply a plot device. It is a visual argument about the nature of safety and what it excludes. Everything inside the wall is known, controlled, beautiful, protected. Everything outside the wall is wild and dangerous and unmeasured and alive. And the film's central dramatic question, whether the Croods belong inside the wall, whether Goal belongs inside the wall, whether any of these characters can find a life that does not require a wall at all, is played out, not just in dialogue and action, but in the persistent, almost choreographic imagery of bodies at thresholds, characters posing at edges, the recurring visual beat of someone standing in a doorway between two worlds, the water. Particularly the running water of the Betterman's cultivated streams and falls is another visual motif worth noting. Water in this film is associated with the Bettermans and with the idea of a controlled channel version of natural force. The waterfalls of the Betterman estate are beautiful and they are managed. Compare this to the wild, unpredictable, enormously dangerous bodies of water that the Croods navigate throughout both films. Rivers that flood, seas that crash, water as an elemental force that cannot be directed or domesticated. This contrast is doing quite thematic work throughout. The Bettermans have learned to channel the wild. The Croods have learned to survive it. And the film's ending suggests that both capacities, the channeling and the surviving, are necessary, that the fullest human life requires both the Betterman's ability to cultivate and the Croods' ability to endure. the sun, and this is something the original film established strongly enough that the sequel can use it as an inherited symbol, is consistently associated in both Croods films with Kai. With the idea of tomorrow, of light coming after darkness, of hope as a physical presence in the world rather than an abstract comfort. In A New Age, the sun takes on a double resonance. It is still Guy's symbol, but it is also the thing that is always on the other side of the Betterman wall. The light inside the estate is filtered, beautiful, controlled. The light outside the estate is direct and sometimes harsh and absolutely unmediated. The film's visual handling of light throughout, the way it shifts and changes depending on where the characters are positioned relative to the war, is a persistent, almost unconscious reinforcement of its central thematic argument. Let me turn now to the larger conversation this film arrived into and what it was reflecting and questioning in the culture of its moment. Because every film is a cultural object as much as an artistic one, it arrives into a specific historical moment with its own texture and anxieties and preoccupations, and the Croods and New Age arrived into a moment that was, in ways both obvious and subtle, trying to feel exactly what this film was offering. The year 2020 was, for most of the world, a year of enforced cohabitation. Families who had been living at the comfortable distance that modern life creates, the distance of work and school and social schedules, and the thousand small separations of ordinary daily existence, was suddenly compressed into shared domestic space for extended periods with very little of the usual pressure relief available. The ordinary frictions of family life were amplified. The ordinary tenderness of family life was also amplified. People discovered, sometimes painfully and sometimes beautifully, what it actually meant to be in close proximity to the people they loved most, what they needed from each other, what they had been taking for granted, what they had been avoiding saying, and what they suddenly could not avoid saying any longer. A film about two families, one chaotic and expressive and physically dense, one ordered and controlled and slightly too polished, being forced into shared domestic space and discovering that they need each other despite every difference between them is, in that context, almost absurdly apt. The Croods, A New Age is not a film about the pandemic. It could not be. It was in production long before the pandemic existed. But it is a film whose central emotional material, the discovery of kinship across difference, the renegotiation of family boundaries under pressure, the specific tenderness that emerges when people are forced to be honest with each other, resonated with the lived experience of its audience in ways that no amount of careful cultural targeting could have engineered. There is also a conversation about progress and its discontents that this film enters and contributes to, and it is a conversation that has been growing louder in the culture for some time. The anxiety about whether our comfort and convenience and accumulated progress has made us better or simply more comfortable, whether the tools and structures of modern life have freed us or merely given our essential anxieties a more sophisticated set of materials to work with, is one of the defining preoccupations of contemporary cultural discourse. The Bettermans embody this anxiety in a form that is light enough for a family film and specific enough to carry genuine meaning. Their treehouse is not satire. The film does not mock them for their aspirations toward comfort and order, but it does ask, with a steady and unembarrassed gaze, whether what they have built has the capacity to accommodate everything a human life actually requires, where their walls, however beautiful, however well constructed, however genuinely intended to keep out danger, can coexist with the kind of wildness that is not a threat but a necessity. This is a question that resonates well beyond the prehistoric setting, and I think it resonates especially strongly for the generation of parents raising children in the current cultural moment. Parents who have more access to the tools of control and protection than any generation in history, who can curate their children's environments and filter their children's information and organize their children's lives with a precision that would have seemed like fantasy to previous generations, and who are at the same time tribute of grit less of that curation, and who are at the head grip, Penandan ho regret Klobat Squirrel Magud. The Betterman question, whether the wall that keeps danger out also keeps something essential in, is the parenting question of the current moment, and the Croods, A New Age, poses it in a form accessible enough for a 7-year-old and resonant enough for their parents to feel it in their chest. There is also something this film does with the idea of chosen versus given family that deserves attention in the cultural context. One of the most significant shifts in how contemporary culture thinks about family, particularly in the Western Anglo-American context that dominates global entertainment, is the growing primacy of chosen family over family of origin. The idea that the people who love you best may not be the people you are born to, that the most meaningful intimacies of a life may be the ones you selected rather than the ones that were assigned to you, is both a relatively new cultural emphasis and an enormously important one for a generation that has expanded its understanding of who counts as family. The Croods, A New Age navigates this tension with more sophistication than its animated family film context might lead you to expect. It does not declare chosen family superior to family of origin. It does not declare family of origin superior to chosen family. It holds both intention and suggests, with its ending, that the fullest life contains both, that the people you are born to and the people you choose can coexist, that love is not a finite resource that must be rationed carefully between the given and the chosen, and that the most beautiful families are often the most improbable ones, the ones that should not, by any rational account, have found each other, and yet somehow, through the specific alchemy of shared experience and the willingness to look at each other honestly, became something that the that is what this film is really about. Not just the Croods and the Bettermans, not just Grug and Gee. It is about what we are willing to build with people who are nothing like us. What we are willing to offer when offering costs us something. What a family actually is when you strip away the accidents of birth and the habits of proximity and ask only, who would you choose if choosing were the only criterion? And the answer this film gives, quietly, warmly, without the slightest trace of sentimentality, because it has earned every note of feeling it produces, is that we would choose the people who challenge us, the ones who show us what we are missing, the ones who know things we do not know and need things we can provide, and whose presence in our lives makes the walls of our world larger than we could have made them alone. Does this film feel timeless or perfectly of its time? I have been sitting with that question, and I want to give you an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. It feels to me like both simultaneously, which is the mark of something that has genuinely connected with a cultural moment without being entirely imprisoned within it. The specific resonances with 2020, the domestic compression, the renegotiation of proximity, the discovery of kinship under pressure, will become more historically specific as time passes. Future audiences will not feel those resonances in the same way because they will not be living them in the same way. But the deeper material, the father learning to let go, the young man learning to look at his grief, the two families discovering that love across difference is the most durable kind, that material does not age. It belongs to the permanent human inventory of things that are always true, always worth saying, always capable of reaching across the distance between a story and the person experiencing it and producing the particular recognition that is one of cinema's greatest gifts. Whether this film will have lasting influence on the broader conversation of animated cinema is a harder question, and I want to be careful about overclaiming. It is not a film that changed the grammar of animation the way certain landmark works have done. It is not a film that will be studied in decades as a formal revolution. But it is a film that made the case, quietly, consistently, through the quality of its attention and honesty of its feeling, that animated family cinema is capable of genuine emotional depths without sacrificing any of the joy and energy and physical comedy that are the irreplaceable right of the form. It made that case in a year when the form needed someone to make it. And for the families who found this film in the specific intimacy of their living rooms in 2020 and 2021, it is a film that will carry the particular warmth of that finding with it forever. The memory not just of what was on screen, but of where they were and who was beside them and what it meant to laugh together and feel something true together when the world outside was frightening and strange. It is not nothing. In fact, that might be everything. From this moment, we go into full spoilers. If you have not yet seen this film, stop here, go experience it first, and come back. Some things deserve to be felt before they are understood. What I want to do in this section is something different from what most spoiler discussions attempt. I do not want to simply recount what happens. I want to trace the emotional logic of the film's revelations, the specific order in which things are disclosed, and what that order does to the experience of watching. Because The Croods: A New Age is a film that has been very deliberately constructed to withhold certain information until precisely the moment when that information will land with maximum force. And understanding how those withheld truths are managed, how the film earns each revelation, how it lays the groundwork for surprises that feel in retrospect inevitable, is one of the most interesting things you can do with this story. Let us begin with the secret that sits at the center of everything. The secret that Phil and Hope Betterman are keeping from the Croods and crucially keeping from Eve. They knew Guy's parents. Not casually, not distantly. They knew them with genuine intimacy and genuine love. Guy's parents, before they died, before Guy was left alone in a world that required a boy to become his own teacher and protector, made an arrangement with the Bettermans. A promise, really. The Bettermans would look after Guy. They would provide for him. They would give him the life that his parents, who sensed the danger approaching, wanted for their son, but could no longer give him themselves. The Betterman estate, the walled garden, the treehouse, the beds and the breakfasts, and the soft, cultivated beauty of it is, at one level of understanding, a monument to a parental love that outlasted the parents who felt it. Phil and Hope built this beautiful place partly for themselves, and partly in the way that Crete sometimes expresses itself through construction and cultivation and the making of things that last, for a boy they had promised to protect. Think about what that means for a moment. Think about the specific painful tenderness of that information. The Bedtamans are not scheming, they are not manipulative in any simple sense. They are people who made a promise to parents who are no longer alive, and they have been waiting, years it seems, a very long time, for the opportunity to fulfill it. When the Croods arrive at their gate with Key among them, Phil and Hope are not simply seeing a family they can manage or compete with. They are seeing the boy they promised to protect finally, improbably, within reach of the promise they made. And the particular flavor of their desperation, the way they pull at Guy, the way they construct situations designed to keep him close, the way they gently but persistently undermine the Croods' comfort in a space that is, after all, theirs, is not the desperation of people who want to win. It is the desperation of people who have been carrying a promise for a very long time and are terrified of letting it down. This is what the film withholds from us for most of its running time, and the withholding is a deliberate and intelligent narrative choice, because we experience the Bettermans for the film's first and second acts primarily through Grug's perspective. And through Grug's perspective, they look a great deal like what his instincts tell him they are, people who have more, who are comfortable in ways that make him feel less, who have designs on his family's cohesion that he cannot fully articulate but can feel with the particular sensitivity of a man who has spent his entire life reading threats. Crow is not wrong about the threat, but he is misreading its nature. The Bettermans are not trying to take his family apart because they are cold or acquisitive or socially ambitious. They are trying to honor a promise made to parents in the specific shadow of death. And that distinction between threat as malice and threat as love is the moral and emotional pivot on which the entire film turns. The mechanics of how the Bettermans manage their agenda are, in the film's second act, both funny and somewhat uncomfortable to watch. Phil conspires with a mixture of genuine warmth and completely unconscious condescension to demonstrate to Guy everything the Betterman life can offer: the bed, the food, the comfort, the specific structured beauty of a life that has been organized rather than merely endured. Hope deploys her hospitality with the particular intensity of a woman who has decided that the right atmosphere, correctly maintained, is a more powerful argument than any direct conversation. Anton, who is entirely innocent of her parents' specific agenda, who simply likes Eve with the pure and uncomplicated enthusiasm of someone who has never had a friend before, becomes, without knowing it, the most effective instrument of the Betterman's plan. Because if Ip and Don become friends, Ip has a reason to stay, and if Ip has a reason to stay, Guy has a reason to stay, and if Guy has a reason to stay, the promise gets fulfilled. But here is where the film makes its most daring structural choice, and I want to give it its due. In the third act, when the Betterman plan is finally exposed, when Grug discovers the full shape of what Phil and Hope have been engineering, and the confrontation between the families moves from comic friction into something rawer and more genuine, the film does not let Grug's anger be the last word. It does not let the revelation function as a simple villain unmasking. Instead, something more interesting and more honest happens. Grug sees the truth about the Betterman's intentions and responds with fury, as you would expect. But Phil, faced with Grug's accusation, does not retreat into denial or counter-accusation. He tells the truth. He explains about the promise. He explains about Guy's parents. And in doing so, he transforms the confrontation from a contest about dominance into something far more vulnerable and far more real. Two people who both love someone, neither of whom can fully give that person what they need, standing across from each other in the specific humility of acknowledged limitation. The scene between Grook and Phil, where the real story finally surfaces, is the scene I would point to as the proof of what this film is capable of at its best. It is not long. It does not have the visual spectacle or the physical comedy of the film's more celebrated sequences. But it achieves something that is genuinely rare in animated family cinema. It takes two characters who have been functioning as comedic rivals and reveals in the space of a few minutes that their rivalry was always a misreading, that what looked like opposition was actually parallel love, the same essential impulse toward protection expressed in completely different registers. Gru, who has defined himself entirely by his physical, immediate, body and bone devotion to his family, and Phil, who has defined himself by the patient construction of a beautiful and safe world, are, at the level of motive, the same person. They have just been building different shelters against the same darkness. And the moment that understanding passes between them, quietly, without fanfare, in the particular stillness that follows the end of a fight that has found its own irrelevance, is one of the most emotionally precise moments in the film. Now let us speak about Key and what the revelation about his parents means for him, because this is the emotional core that everything else has been built around, and it deserves the fullest attention. Kay has spent both films moving forward. It is, as we have discussed, his defining characteristic, his survival mechanism, his gift and his limitation simultaneously. He is the boy who always looks at the horizon, and the specific cost of always looking at the horizon is that you cannot also look at what is behind you. You cannot also look at the particular shape of what you lost and allow yourself to feel its full weight. Guy has been managing his grief about his parents, the grief of a child left alone, the grief of a boy who had to become his own teacher and protector by converting it entirely into momentum, into forward motion, into the effortful, beautiful, genuine optimism that is his most attractive quality and also, in the deepest sense, his most carefully maintained defense. When the Bettermans tell him the full truth about his parents, when he learns that his parents knew the Bettermans, that they made arrangements, that they thought ahead to a future they would not be present for and tried to build something into that future that would take care of their son. Guy experiences something that the film renders with genuine emotional care. He does not receive this information as simple comfort. He receives it as complexity, because the specific comfort it offers, the knowledge that his parents loved him far enough forward that they thought about who would look after him when they were gone, is inseparable from the grief it reopens. It makes his parents more present, more specific, more real than they have been for the entirety of both films. And that presence is beautiful and it is painful in equal measure. And Guy does not know for a moment which of those things to feel first. The scene where Guy sits with this information really sits with it in the way that the film has been preparing us to see him unable to do, is rendered with a visual delicacy that I think is the finest single piece of filmmaking in the film. I mentioned earlier that there is a shot involving Guy and the change in the quality of light around him that I was saving for this section. Here it is. In the moment when Guy finally stops moving forward, when he allows himself to be still, to be with the weight of what he has learned, to feel rather than convert, the light around him shifts from the directed, organized, Betterman quality illumination that has saturated the estate throughout the film into something warmer and less controlled. Something that comes from no particular source but seems to emanate from the air itself. It is a subtle effect, perhaps 2 or 3 seconds of gradual change, but what it does visually is remove Guy from the Betterman world and place him in something older and more personal, in the quality of a light that feels like memory, in the warmth of something that has been waiting for him to be ready to feel it. It is the moment the film has been building toward for almost 90 minutes, and Crawford and his animation team find a visual language for it that requires no dialogue and offers no explanation. It simply shows you what it means to finally let yourself feel the thing you have been running from, to stop and let it catch up with you, to discover that grief, when you finally stop running from it, does not destroy you. It holds you. The scene between Grug and Guy that follows, and now I can speak about it fully, having been careful to preserve it through the earlier sections, is the scene that most clearly earns everything the film has been building. Grug, who has spent the entirety of both films defining his relationship with Guy through the proxy of competition and protective suspicion, sits with the young man and speaks to him in a register that is entirely new, not as a rival, not as a skeptical father-in-law in training, as a person who recognizes in Guy's specific loneliness, in the particular shape of a young man who has been living at the edge of a family rather than inside one, something that his own love has failed to address. Druk has been so busy protecting Eve from Geet that he has not quite thought to offer Geet protection from anything. He has not extended the particular shelter of his enormous, clumsy, inexhaustible love to the young man who has been standing just outside it, and in this scene he does, not with ceremony, not with a speech, with the particular inarticulate directness of a man who is not good with words and knows it and says the true thing anyway, because the true thing needs saying, and the words do not have to be beautiful for the meaning to be real. This moment between Druk and Guy is, to me, the single scene in the Croods, a new age, that most fully justifies the film's existence. It could not have been in the first film because the relationship had not developed enough to sustain it. It required everything that came before, the rivalry, the friction, the comedy of misrecognition, the slow and sometimes painful accumulation of a relationship that was always beneath its surface tensions, rooted in a shared and absolute love for Eve, to make this moment of genuine recognition possible and real. And when it arrives with the particular quiet force of something that was always going to happen, but could only happen when the characters were ready. When Grug extends his enormous hand toward Kai, it is not a gesture of welcome. It is more specific and more costly than welcome. It is a gesture of acknowledgement, of seeing, of saying without saying it in words, I know what you carry. I know what it cost you to carry it alone. You do not have to carry it alone anymore. I want to speak now about the film's action climax because it has been somewhat overlooked in the emotional discussion and it is more interesting than it might first appear. The punch monkeys, those extraordinary, chaotic, endlessly renewable creatures of the film's wide second half, become the mechanism through which the film's third act achieves its physical resolution. The sequence in which both families are forced to work together against a threat that neither can handle alone is, at the level of spectacle, exactly what it is supposed to be: kinetic, funny, visually inventive, escalating with the specific joyful logic of great animated action. But what makes it more than spectacle is what it is doing to the family dynamics simultaneously. Because the chaos of the punch monkey sequence forces every character out of their established position and into a state of pure reactive collaboration. There is no time for rivalry. There is no space for the performance of identity, the Betterman's careful cultivation of their superiority, the Croods' defensive assertion of their authenticity, when everyone is equally, hilariously, completely in over their heads. The chaos is a great equalizer. It strips away everything that has been keeping these two families in their separate corners and reveals what was always there beneath the performance: two groups of people who love each other and who, given a sufficient external pleasure, will instinctively reach for each other rather than pulling apart. There is a specific moment in this sequence: Druk and Phil, fighting side by side, their entirely different physical approaches to the same problem, creating an improvisational coordination that neither of them plan and both of them somehow achieve. That is the film's most joyful piece of character writing. Because what it demonstrates, wordlessly and in motion, is that these two men who have been circling each other for the entire film are actually at the level of instinct and love and the willingness to put their bodies between danger and the people they care about, almost exactly the same. Different in every surface quality, identical in every essential one. The comedy of their collaboration is inseparable from the warmth of the recognition it generates, and that combination, funny and true simultaneously, the laugh arriving at the same moment as the feeling, is the rarest and most valuable thing an animated film can produce. The resolution of the third act involves something that I want to pause on because it is handled with more grace than most discussions of the film acknowledge. The Betterman wall, that central visual and thematic metaphor, comes down, not through destruction, not through defeat, but through a choice. The specific shape of that choice and who makes it is quietly perfect. It is not Grug who tears down the wall. It would be easy and somewhat obvious for Grug, the embodiment of the wild, the Groot who most represents everything outside the wall, to be the agent of its removal. But the film is smarter than that. The wall comes down because the people inside it choose to open it. Phil and Hope make the choice, and they make it not because they have been defeated or proven wrong, but because they have been shown something their wall was too high to see, that the world beyond their beautiful, protected, carefully cultivated garden contains not just danger but abundance, not just chaos but life, not just the threat they have been protecting themselves from but a specific, wild, irreplaceable vitality that their wall has been keeping out along with everything else. This is a genuinely sophisticated narrative choice. It respects the Betterman's agency. It does not require them to become something other than what they are in order to participate in the film's resolution. Hope and Phil do not abandon their values or their aesthetics or their preference for order and cultivation. They simply extend the perimeter of what they are willing to cultivate. They make the wall larger. Large enough to include the Croods, large enough to include the wilderness beyond, large enough to contain both the organized and the wild in a relationship of mutual enrichment rather than mutual exclusion. And in that expansion, the film's central thematic argument achieves its visual and emotional resolution. The world does not disappear, it becomes a home. That is the difference. That is what the film has been working toward. The ending, which takes the two families into a shared domestic arrangement that is both hilarious and genuinely moving, earns every note of warmth it produces. There is a sequence near the close of the film where we see Grug and Phil sitting together in the kind of exhausted, wordless, deeply comfortable male silence that exists only between people who have survived something together. And that silence, after 2 hours of noise and rivalry and the sustained comedy of incarnation, is one of the most satisfying shots in the film. Not because the conflict has been neatly resolved, but because it has been genuinely transformed. These are two people who will continue to drive each other completely insane on a daily basis and who have simultaneously discovered that they would not entirely have it otherwise. That specific texture of love, the exasperated, affectionate, mutually dependent love of people who are bound together not by similarity but by something stronger, is the film's final, truest note. The ending also gave Ski something that neither film has previously given him: stillness. For perhaps the first time across both films, Key arrives at a moment of genuine rest. Not the relentless forward motion, not the horizon-gazing optimism, not the cheerful busyness of a person who has learned to outrun their own interior. Just stillness. The specific stillness of a person who has arrived somewhere, not as a destination but as a belonging. The Croods were always his family. The Bettermans he now understands were always his family too. He does not have to choose between them. He does not have to define himself by forward motion any longer, because the place he has been moving toward has turned out to be not a place at all, but a network of relationships, improbable, difficult, irreplaceable, that he has been building across both films and has now, finally, the permission to inhabit. Ape and Donner given a farewell scene near the close of the film that is, for my money, the most quietly beautiful moment in the entire story. Two girls who found each other in the middle of everything, in the chaos of their family's conflict, in the wide improbability of a friendship between a girl who grew up inside walls and a girl who grew up without them, say goodbye with the specific bodily reluctance of people who have discovered in each other something they did not know they were missing. The scene does not over dramatize the moment, it does not turn it into a declaration. It simply shows you two people standing at a threshold, and there is that motif again, one last time quietly, at the edge of two worlds, and choosing to hold a connection even as the distance returns. That moment, which is barely 30 seconds of screen time, contains more genuine feeling about female friendship and the specific grief of separation from someone who truly sees you than most films manage in entire acts devoted to the subject. The post-credits sequence, which offers a brief comic coda involving the Betterman animals and the particular chaos that follows the opening of the world, is lighter in tone than the film's emotional conclusion and is primarily there to send the audience out on a note of pure delight rather than reflection. It is not narratively significant, but it is generously made and genuinely funny, and demonstrates that the filmmakers understood the specific grammar of the post-credits beat, give the audience something that asks nothing of them except laughter, something that feels like a gift after the work of the main film. It works. It earns its smiles. What I keep returning to. After everything, after the revelations and the confrontations and the chaos and the quiet moments that carry the most weight, is the specific image of Grug at the film's close. Not the action version of Grug, not the comedy version, not the fiercely protective, loudly present, physically overwhelming version that fills most of the film's running time. The still version, the version that exists in the moments after the noise, when the story has arrived somewhere and Drew is simply present in it. There is something in Nicolas Cage's voice in these final moments, a quietness, a subtleness that carries the entire emotional journey of both films within it. He is not diminished. He is, if anything, larger than he was at the beginning, because the largeness is no longer expressed through volume and dominance, but through the particular capacity to hold space for people who have moved beyond needing him the way they once did, and to love them just as fiercely in the new configuration. That is the emotional achievement of Gruga as a character across these two films, and it is not a small one. It is, in fact, exactly what the best animated family cinema can do. Take a simple character concept, the overprotective father, and find, through story and performance and the accumulated weight of genuine investment in who that character is, something true and universal and quietly beautiful inside it. The Croods, A New Age is a film that ends not with triumph but with arrival. There is a difference and it matters. Triumph is about defeating something. Arrival is about becoming something. The Croods at the end of this film have not defeated the Bettermans or the world or the forces that threaten their cohesion. They have arrived at a version of themselves that is larger, more complex, more generous, and more alive than the version that existed at the beginning. They have arrived at a family that is bigger than blood and louder than reason, and more durable than any wall. And that arrival, unhurried, imperfect, genuinely earned, is what makes the ending of this film feel, against all expectation, like exactly the right place to land. There is a particular thing that happens after a film ends, not always, not with every film, but with the ones that have genuinely reached you, where the story continues inside you even after the screen has gone dark, where the characters persist in your peripheral vision for days afterward, not as vivid presences, but as quiet residues, as emotional textures that color the way you move through your own life in the hours and days that follow. You find yourself thinking about a scene while you are doing something entirely unrelated. You hear a line of dialogue surface in your mind unbidden. You notice something in your own life, a conversation with someone you love, a moment of friction or tenderness or the particular difficulty of saying something true, and you think that is what that film was about. That is what it was pointing at. And in that recognition, the film becomes more than the sum of its parts. It becomes a lens. The Croods and New Age has been that kind of film for me, not in the way that the greatest films become lenses, not with the shattering, revelatory clarity of a work that reorganizes your entire understanding of something, more quietly than that, more domestically, in the way that a conversation with someone who knows you well can be a lens, in the way that a moment of unexpected kindness received or offered can suddenly illuminate a whole architecture of feeling that you had not previously been able to see clearly. Single moment in this film that has not left me, the moment I return to when I think about what this film is and what it was trying to give its audience, is not the big action sequence. It is not the emotional climax between Gru and Finn. It is not even the ending, which is warm and generous and exactly right. It is the moment, brief and quiet and placed in the middle of the film's second act almost without ceremony, when Guy stands in the Betterman garden alone and looks at something that connects him to his parents. He is not speaking. He is barely moving. He is simply present with a feeling that the film has been careful, until this moment, not to let him be fully present with. And in that stillness, in that held breath of a moment, the film reveals what it has been about all along. Not the rivalry between families, not the comedy of prehistoric last tension, not even the father-daughter story that carries the film's primary emotional thread. It has been about what it costs to carry loss with you into a life that is otherwise full of light. About the specific invisible weight of grief that has been converted so thoroughly into forward motion that even the person carrying it has almost forgotten it is there. I keep returning to that moment because it is honest in a way that animated family films rarely allow themselves to be honest. It does not reach for that honesty through sentimentality or through the kind of emotional manipulation that announces itself with swelling strings and close-up tears. It reaches for it through stillness, through the simple radical act of letting the character be alone with something true for long enough that the truth becomes visible. That is cinema doing what only cinema can do, giving you access to an interior state through nothing more than the quality of light on a face, the rhythm of a breath, the particular way a body holds itself when it is finally, after a very long time, not performing for anyone. Did this film change how I see something? I think it did, though not in the grand seismic way that the word change sometimes implies. It reminded me, and I say reminded rather than taught, because I think this is something most of us know, but tend to misplace in the business of daily life, that the people who challenge us most fiercely are often the people who are most similar to us in the ways that matter. That the fiction between two people who are trying to protect the same thing from different directions is not evidence of incompatibility but of parallel love. That the most durable families, the ones that outlast difficulty, that expand rather than contract under pressure, are almost never the ones that were designed. They are the ones that were found, stumbled into, built slowly and imperfectly and with a great deal of noise out of materials that were not supposed to fit together and that somehow, against all reasonable expectation, do. I think about Gru. I think about that enormous, infuriating, completely present love of his, the love that holds too tight and speaks too loud and takes up too much room, and is, beneath all of that, the most genuine and most costly love in the film. And so I think about the people in my own life who love like that, who hold like that, whose protection sometimes feels like confinement, and whose devotion is sometimes indistinguishable from control, and who would, without question, place themselves between you and whatever darkness was coming without a moment's hesitation, and without expecting a single word of gratitude in return. There is something new in the specific shape of his love and the specific cost of its transformation that I recognize, that I think most people, if they are honest, will recognize. The love that has to learn to open its hands is not a specific prehistoric father's problem. It is a human problem. It has always been a human problem. and a film that makes that problem visible and legible and crucially sympathetic, that refuses to make the grip-tight love into a simple villain, is doing something worth doing. The kind of person who will carry this film with them is, I think, someone who has experienced both sides of that love, someone who has been held too tightly and understood, even while pulling away, that the tightness was not malice but fear. Someone who has loved someone so much that the thought of their independence felt for a moment like an abandonment. Someone who has sat with the gap between what they intended to offer and what they actually gave, and tried to close that gap not through certainty or resolution but through the slow, imperfect, ongoing practice of trying again. This film will be carried by parents who are watching their children reach for the horizon and trying, with everything they have, to open their hands. And it will be carried by children who are reaching for that horizon and turning back sometimes to see the hands opening behind them and understanding finally what that opening costs. It will also be carried, and I want to say this clearly, by anyone who has loved across difference, anyone who has built something real with people who were supposed to be incompatible with them. Anyone who has discovered that the most important relationships of their life were the ones that looked from the outside like the most unlikely ones. The Croods and the Bettermans should not work. By every surface measure, they are incompatible. They eat differently and sleep differently and move through the world with entirely different assumptions about what the world is and what it requires of you. And yet, the film finds in the space between those incompatibilities something that is not compromise and is not defeat and is not even tolerance. It finds affection, the specific, surprised, slightly reluctant affection of people who have discovered that the world is larger than their map of it, and that the people who live beyond the edges of that map are not threats but gifts. Would I return to this film? Yes, without question, yes. Not because it is perfect, we have already spoken honestly about where it falls short, and I stand behind every one of those honest observations. But because a film does not have to be perfect to be worth returning to, it has to be alive, and The Croods: A New Age is alive in all the ways that matter. It has warmth that is not manufactured. It has characters who feel like people even through the broad comedy and the prehistoric exaggeration. It has moments, specific, particular, irreplaceable moments where the cinema screen seems to disappear and you are simply in the presence of something true. Those moments are enough. They are, in fact, more than enough. They are the reason I keep watching films, keep sitting in the dark or on the sofa or wherever the screen finds me, keep hoping that the next story will do the thing that the best stories do. Show me something I already knew in a way I could not have articulated without the film's help. I will return to this film in the specific way that I return to things that have been kind to me, quietly, without ceremony, when the mood is right and the moment calls for something that is neither simple entertainment nor demanding art, but the specific, irreplaceable thing that lives between those categories, something warm and alive and genuinely made, something that cares about the people experiencing it and shows that care in every frame. Now let me bring this essay to its close. Let me try to say, in the compressed and honest language of a final thought, what The Croods: A New Age actually is, and who it is for, and whether it is worth your time and your attention and the particular vulnerability of sitting with the story and allowing it to matter to you. The Croods: A New Age is not a perfect film. I have been careful to say that throughout this essay, and I want to say it again here, clearly and without apology, because I think the most genuine form of respect you can pay a film is to see it completely, to acknowledge both what it achieves and what it falls short of, without using either as an excuse to avoid the other. The second act has structural looseness. Several supporting characters deserve more interior life than the screenplay provides. The tonal shift into the third act's physical spectacle arrives slightly before the emotion and material has been given its full due, and you feel that timing as a very minor but real form of deflation before the genuine emotional resolution arrives to restore what was briefly lost. These are real observations about a real film made by real people working at the limits of their time and budget and the particular constraints of developing a sequel in a studio under transition. They are worth naming. And also, Also, this film contains genuine warmth. It contains a visual ambition that rewards attention. It contains voice performances, Nicolas Cage and Peter Dinklage in particular, that are operating at a level of emotional precision that the casual viewer may not fully register, but that the attentive one will feel in their body. It contains in the relationship between Eve and Dawn one of the most honest and least sentimentalized depictions of new female friendship in recent animated cinema. It contains in Grug's arc across both films a genuinely moving portrait of paternal love in the specific process of learning to become something larger than it was. And it contains, in the quiet moment between Grug and Dee that I have held up throughout this essay as the film's truest achievement, a scene of such simple and emotional honesty that it would not feel out of place in a film twice as acclaimed and half as entertaining. Who will love this film most deeply? Parents. Specifically, parents who are somewhere in the middle of the particular journey that Grug is on, parents who are watching the children they have loved and protected and occasionally smothered move steadily toward a life that has its own center of gravity, its own logic, its own people and places and futures that do not require the parent as a fixed point. Those parents will find in this film not just entertainment but recognition. The specific bittersweet recognition of seeing your own love reflected in an animated prehistoric man who is simultaneously completely absurd and completely real, and understanding through that reflection something about the shape of your own feeling that you had not previously been able to see from the inside. Adult children of protective parents will find it too, will find in Eve's careful navigation between the family she loves and the future she is building a portrait of a familiar tension rendered with more sympathy and more complexity than it usually receives. The film does not blame Eve for reaching. It does not blame Gru for holding. It holds both in equal honest light and says, this is what love in motion looks like. This is what it costs everyone involved. This is how it is and it is what. Young people who have built families of choice, who have found their people in the particular, improbable, absolutely real way that chosen family is found, will find in the Croods Betterman merger a reflection of their own experience. The absurdity of it, the friction of it, the specific delight of discovering that the people you were not supposed to fit with are, in fact, the people who make your world larger and stranger and more alive. Children will love it because it is funny and beautiful and warm and full of creatures that exist nowhere except in the specific, saturated, hyper-real world of this franchise, and because it tells them, in a language they can feel without fully articulating, that family is not a fixed thing but a growing thing, that the people who love you can learn to love differently, that the world is wider than the walls that were built to protect you, and that going beyond those walls does not mean leaving the love behind. As for how to see it, cinema is always the ideal. The visual ambition of this film, the color, the composition, the specific quality of light that the DreamWorks Animation team has built into every frame deserves the largest screen available to you. If that opportunity has passed, streaming is a genuine and worthy alternative, and as I noted earlier in this essay, there is something about the domestic context, the particular intimacy of watching this story about families in the company of your own family, that serves the film's emotional intentions in a way that is almost better than theatrical viewing. This is not a film that requires the dark and the distance of a cinema to do its best work. It requires proximity. It requires the particular vulnerability of watching with someone beside you. It requires, ideally, a sofa and someone you love, and a specific willingness to let something small and warm and genuinely made reach you. Own it if you love it. It belongs in the permanent collection of films that a family returns to, not because it is spectacular, but because it is kind, because you know something about the people watching it and honors what it knows, because it sends you back into your own life, slightly more willing to open your hands. My rating for the Croods, A New Age, is 7 out of 10, and here is the single true sentence that earns it. This is a film that reaches for something real inside the frame of something commercial, and in its best moments, the quiet ones, the ones between the noise, it finds exactly what it was reaching for, and those moments are generous enough to carry the whole. 7 out of 10. Not despite the places it falls short, but in full knowledge of them, and in full knowledge simultaneously of what it achieves. The score is an honest accounting of a film that is more than the sum of its weaknesses, and exactly as good as its strengths allow it to be, which is, in the end, all any film can ask of itself, all any of us can ask of ourselves. Cinema at its truest is not about the perfect, it is about the reaching, it is about the frame around the human face and what that frame reveals. It is about the specific, unrepeatable transaction between a story that has been made with care and a person who has brought their whole self to the watching of it. The Croods, a new age, made that transaction honestly. It gave what it had, and what it had was, on the best days of its making, something genuinely worth giving. A family standing at the edge of a walled garden, looking at the wilderness beyond it and choosing, not without fear, not without cost, not without the particular grief of things that must be released before new things can be held, to open the gate. That is the image I carry from this film. That is the image I leave you with. Now, before I go, I want to take a moment and speak to you directly, not as the voice of an essay, but as the person who wrote it and who means every word. Thank you for being here. Thank you for spending this time in this particular corner of cinema with me. This influx exists because of you, because you are the kind of person who wants more from a film than the plot, who wants to understand what a story is doing beneath what it is showing, who believes, as I believe, that cinema is one of the most extraordinary ways human beings have ever found to say, here is what it is like to be alive. Here is what I felt, here is what I found, and here is my hand reaching toward yours across the dark. If this essay moved you or challenged you or simply kept you company for a while, I would love it if you would leave a like below. It costs you nothing and it means more than I can easily say. And if you subscribe, if you decide that Design Flux is the kind of place you want to keep coming back to, then I promise you that every essay I make will be made with the same care and the same honesty and the same genuine love for cinema that I have tried to bring to every word of this one. I have a few questions for you to take into the comments because I genuinely want to hear your thoughts and I think this film deserves a real conversation. First, where does the Croods anyway sit for you in the landscape of animated sequel? Does it earn its existence or does it ultimately feel like the franchise extending itself beyond its natural conclusion? Second, the relationship between Gru and Guy. The specific shape of how a father and the young man who loves his daughter find their way toward each other. Does it resonate with something in your own life? A relationship you have lived from either side of it. And third, the film's central question about walls, about whether the things we build to protect ourselves always cost us something we did not mean to give up. Where do you feel that in your own world? I would genuinely love to read what you write. Leave it below. Let us have the conversation that this film started. The next essay on the Cineflux takes us somewhere different in tone and word, but equally rich in meaning. A film that arrived quietly and became, for the people who found it, something close to essential. I will not say more than that yet. Some things are better discovered than announced, but I think you are going to want to be here for it. That is the Cineflux. I will see you in the next one.